Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. The Odyssey, one of the oldest and most influential poems in the history of Western literature, may not have been written by anyone. The man we call Homer may never have existed. There may have been no single author, no moment of composition, no individual genius sitting down to produce this work. The poem you're about to study may be the product not of a person but of a tradition. Centuries of oral performance, shaped and refined by generations of singers whose names are entirely lost to us. And here is the extraordinary thing. Once you understand that, the Odyssey becomes more interesting, not less. This series is about the Odyssey, Homer's poem of homecoming, of cunning and endurance, of a man trying to get back to where he belongs. Over 12 weeks, we will read it closely, think about it seriously, and discover why it has been considered essential reading for nearly 3,000 years. But we begin here, with the author question, because how you think about authorship determines how you read the poem. The ancient world itself was uncertain about Homer. 7 different cities claimed to be his birthplace. The biographical tradition produced vivid but contradictory accounts. Homer was Ionian or Aeolian. He was born on Chios or Smyrna, or Colophon, or half a dozen other places. He was blind, as legend had it, though many scholars now suspect this detail was a later symbolic attribution. The idea that a poet of such inward vision must have been deprived of outer sight. The ancient world's uncertainty about Homer is itself significant. By the time the biographical curiosity arose, by the time anyone thought to ask who he was, the poems had already been circulating for long enough that their origins were genuinely obscure. The trail was cold before anyone thought to follow it. What the ancient world never doubted was the poems' extraordinary quality and their cultural centrality. Homer was, for Greeks and Romans alike, the foundational poet, the source of moral exemplar, the educator of warriors, the authority on the gods. Plato quoted him constantly, even though he worried about the influence of poetry on the young. Alexander the Great slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, annotated by his tutor Aristotle. The Roman poet Virgil spent 11 years writing the Aeneid, in part because he could not escape the shadow of Homer. You do not need to know who Homer was to understand why the poems have this stature, but you do need to understand how they were made. In the 1920s, a young American scholar named Milman Parry had a theory. He had been studying the recurring phrases in Homer, the rosy-fingered dawn, swift-footed Achilles, the wine-dark sea, and he had noticed something. These phrases were not decorative. They were not simply poetic flourishes. They were metrically precise. Each one fit a specific position in the Greek verse line with the exactness of a key fitting a lock. Parry's insight was that these formulaic phrases were not the mark of a poet who lacked imagination. They were the tools of a poet who composed without writing. To test his theory, Parry went to Yugoslavia in the early 1930s, where a living tradition of oral epic poetry still existed. He recorded hundreds of hours of performances by singers called guzlari, men who could produce poems of thousands of lines in live performance, without manuscripts, without rehearsal, composing in the moment by drawing on a repertoire of inherited formulas and story patterns absorbed over years of training. What Parry and his student Albert Claude demonstrated was that Homeric composition works by exactly the same principle. The formulas are not repetition, they are a system. The trained singer does not memorize a fixed text and recite it. He composes in performance, deploying the formula system to build each line as he sings it, shaping the traditional story for the particular audience and occasion. Every performance of the poem is simultaneously the same poem and the new poem. This has a remarkable implication. We think of writing as what makes literature possible, the technology that pins a text down and preserves it. Parry's work suggests that some of the most architecturally perfect poetry in the Western tradition was composed without writing at all. The oral tradition did not produce rough, improvised verse. It produced, over centuries of competitive performance and audience selection, poetry of extraordinary formal sophistication. Lord's book on all this, The Singer of Tales, published in 1960, remains essential reading for anyone serious about Homer. So what do we do with this? How do we read a poem that may have no author? The scholar Gregory Nage, in a series of influential studies, proposes that what we call Homer is best understood not as a person, but as a tradition that crystallized gradually through centuries of performance, particularly in the great Panathenaic festival at Athens, where rhapsodes were required to perform the Homeric poems in sequence. On this model, the text we have is the product of a long process of competitive selection, refinement, and stabilization. The name Homer attaches to the tradition itself, not to an individual. M.L. West, one of the 20th century's most rigorous classical scholars, went further and suggested that the name Homer may even carry meaning. It may derive from a Greek word meaning he who fits together, the hostage of tradition, the assembler of inherited parts into a coherent whole. None of this should diminish the achievement. The practical consequence of the authorship question for us as readers is paradoxically liberating. Because we cannot anchor these poems in a specific biographical life, cannot read the Odyssey as the work of a man who suffered a particular loss or experienced a particular exile. We are thrown back entirely on the poems themselves. The text is its own evidence for the intelligence that shaped it. And what that text reveals is a shaping intelligence of the first order. The Odyssey sets in motion 4 narrative threads simultaneously: Telemachus' education in Ithaca, Odysseus' wanderings, the crisis at home, and the divine councils on Olympus that frame the action and brings them all to convergence with the precision of a mechanism. These are not accidental feats of organization. Whether accomplished by one poet or by a tradition that had been refining these structures for generations, they represent a quality of creative intelligence that has never been surpassed. We do not know who Homer was. We have his poem, and that is more than enough. Next week we turn to the world Homer built, Bronze Age Greece, the Mycenaean civilization whose collapse haunts the poem, and the gods who move through the Odyssey not as metaphors, but as active forces shaping human fate. If you're the kind of person who has always meant to read Homer seriously, not just know about him, but actually read and understand the poem, this series is designed for you. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and I'll see you next Thursday.